Hi, I'm Joseph. I'm a front-end engineer at Simply Business. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how downgrading a single project dependency can be a lot more difficult than you think. And it all comes down to the way package versions are defined. While preparing these slides, I came across this article on Hacker News, which advocates for using a simple rule. Never use a dependency that you could replace with an afternoon of programming. I think dependency is a quick and easy choice until it's no longer quick or easy. For today's talk, I thought we should start with a grandma's carrot cake recipe. There's vegetable oil, there's eggs, flour, sugar, carrots, walnuts, everything you would expect in a carrot cake. Well, there is nothing for the icing, but that would be way too many ingredients to fit onto the slide. So forget the icing, let's focus on the cake. If you look at these ingredients, these quantities look fairly reasonable, even though I haven't baked a carrot cake yet. So in this hypothetical world, I use the instructions provided to bake this cake, and voila, it works. Then, about a year later, I remember my grandma's carrot cake recipe again. And I think to myself, great, I'll just get the recipe book out, have a look through the notes, and bake a wonderful cake again. But I look at the ingredients, ingredient list looks okay, but the quantities seem way off. How can it be? How did this change? Why did this need to change? And who changed this? Where is my recipe that was just perfect? So many questions. I look around and I can't find any answers. Everyone has moved on away from the carrot cake as it's just no longer cool. Everyone's making blueberry basil frozen yogurt and knows nothing about my carrot cake. But now you're probably wondering, where does yarn come into all of this? Well, recently I've been upgrading dependencies in a project I'm working on. I noticed that one of my dependencies, Gatsby, has a bug in the very latest version. I thought to myself, if I just roll a version or two back, I'm going to be in a good place. I went through Gatsby's changelogs, couldn't find anything related to my bug. So I went to the issue section before I eventually found myself looking at a pull request that's refactoring and optimizing page scroll position when you navigate from one page to the next. I then tracked the commit to a particular version of Gatsby, as well as its release date. And then I thought, all I need to do is to pick up one version before the one where the bug was introduced, and everything will work just great. That's what I thought, but there is one but. It didn't work. I got a bunch of errors. With one version of Gatsby, it would complain about reducers, which made me wonder, where is this being used? My app doesn't even use Redux. So I would downgrade another version down. That would then throw some yoga layout pre-built and handled exception. So I kept digging and looking. I found that people were complaining about running into same errors, but in different circumstances. Then I came across various workarounds that worked for some, but not others, including me. Turns out, Yarn has this wonderful feature called selective dependency resolutions. It's a set of instructions to simply say, if some dependency needs a package in version 1.2.5, I actually want to make sure that you install 1.2.3 instead. In the context of my issue, people were suggesting not only I install an older version of Gatsby, but also use this selective dependency resolutions feature provided by Yarn. And the way it works is through a resolutions property in a package JSON file. This resolutions property instructs Yarn to install a particular version of Gatsby dependency. This worked, I had Gatsby at this not the very latest version, but I was still more up to date than what I had before. On top of that, I had some random packages in my selective dependency resolutions instructions in my package.json file. I thought I'd leave a comment above those selective dependency resolutions, just to explain to whoever comes across this that this isn't normal and this is why. But you can't leave any comments in package.json. I mean, you can, but it's through some very ugly hacks. One of them is on this slide. You kind of have to ask yourself, would a comment like this be any useful to my future self and other developers, or make things even more confusing? However, that's something for another time. Let's go back and take a look at how we ended up here. When I was working on my slides, Gatsby was still on version 220 something, but probably by now they have version 3 out. A lot can happen in a week. As package versions change, it's important that we establish some ground for how we version packages. I'm sure a lot of us have heard of semantic versioning, but let's take a closer look at the definition of semantic versioning. Here is my semantic versioning. Carrying on with the carrot cake theme, this is a major cake. So in semantic versioning, this represents a major version, which you can use when you make incompatible API changes. Thing going from V1 to V2. Next, we have a slice of cake, which represents a minor version change, which we use when we add functionality in a backwards compatible manner. Think version 1.1 to 1.2. And finally, we have a carrot, which represents a tiny change known as a patch, which we use when we make backwards compatible bug fixes. Think version 1.0.0 to 1.0.1. So this is semantic versioning in a nutshell, but semantic versioning is as good as what developers make of it in the real world. There is nothing to stop me from making major changes and putting them down as a patch change in my library update. The ultimate decision makers are developers like me and you. Semantic versioning is an agreed standard, but it doesn't prevent people from shipping code that breaks something upstream or downstream. There's another good example when it comes to semantics. It's a bit like semantic HTML. You can use semantic HTML, like here on the left-hand side, but you can also stick everything into different divs and create what is called divitis, when everything is nested in a bunch of divs. Other than visual representation of the content, there is nothing to tell a machine that the content I placed into a particular HTML tag is my header content, or my nav content, or my footer content. You could obviously argue that in some circumstances, this makes no difference because your application does not have accessibility or SEO needs. I would say that good habits matter. So if you're familiar with good practices, you should use them everywhere by default. But just like with semantic versioning, this isn't enforced by default. So it's down to an individual to make that choice. Coming back to semantic versioning, if you take package maintainers, for example, there is no easy way of knowing whether their patch change in some other context, such as another project, can actually be quite major. There is no tree graph to say, hey, your dependency is used by 10,000 other projects and your proposed code change will break builds in 70% of them. So you can't call it a patch. Can you think of another way? Would it be worth to ensure backwards compatibility? We should ask ourselves, can we develop software that is beyond, I think this is the next big thing, so everybody should adopt my change from now onwards? Can decisions be more data rather than instinct driven? Because ultimately, this comes down to the fact that some libraries have great change logs, they adhere to best standards and practices, but this is not a given. How many times we have found ourselves in a position where we were confident that a patch or a minor version bump would work just fine. especially when you open your repository and you see a number of pull requests opened by Dependabot. You pick one, think, this is no big deal, merge it away, and then something goes wrong in production. And then the next time you say that Dependabot PR, you think to yourself, I'm not touching that. I'll come back to this patch bump another time. Standardizing package releases and version management would go a long way to addressing this problem. You could employ some analytics mechanism that takes your proposed library changes and runs it against a sample of repositories to check for possible breakages. It could also enforce a form of semantic versioning. It could say, hey, compared to a similar type of changes in other libraries, a change you are proposing looks more like a major than a minor change. This is only hypothetical, and I can only imagine what might be on Dependabot's roadmap. When you look at the range of and variety of packages on NPM registry today, you can see that all of this is community driven. So there is an argument that imposing more rules and restrictions would prevent people from contributing to open source, which is free. Going back to my original problem, what I came to realize after hours of debugging is that my picked Gatsby dependency version is prefixed with a simple caret symbol. And when you look at documentation, whenever you run yarn add package name, it will use a caret symbol by default. This means that whenever you run yarn install, it will use this symbol as an instruction to determine which version within a provided range it will pick. This could come very handy if, let's say, a library that you're using issues a security patch or for a package that your project depends on. When you run yarn install, the caret means that most up-to-date version containing a security patch will be picked. So if you pin your Gatsby version so that it's written as, for example, 3.0.0 without any symbols around it, this will ensure that you get 3.0.0 and nothing else. But as the story goes, there is one but. Gatsby itself has a bunch of dependencies, and as you can see in this slide, most of them have a caret symbol at the start. This means most of these dependency versions will fluctuate over time. Installing a version of a package today in a given environment might result in something that works, but installing the same version a year later might no longer work. It might throw errors where something isn't right with Redux, or that something isn't right with Yoga layout pre-built. This is what happened in my case. So how do we fix this? Remember selective dependency resolutions feature provided by Yarn? Well, if your Gatsby with a pinned version has a dependency that isn't pinned, you can also control that through selective dependency resolutions. All you need to do is to prefix your package name with a double star and a slash, just like on the slide. This isn't ideal because there's no way to know which dependency might be causing problems. In Gatsby's case, I counted 141 direct dependencies. How do you know which one is causing the problem when error messages are as clear as mud? This is what is known as dependency hell. It's this informal expression used to express developer frustration when installed software packages have dependencies on specific versions of other software packages. In Gatsby's case, those 141 dependencies will have their own set of dependencies, so you might go down a rabbit hole, never to be seen again. Here is an example of an NPM package delivery that ends up being a little more than you would expect. So at this stage, I should say that I came up with another lightweight JavaScript library that will solve all your problems. But I don't think anybody needs yet another lightweight JavaScript library. Instead, I want to come back to my carrot cake recipe. Remember how my recipe magically changed a year later? Everything seemed way off. Let's take another look. This isn't right, but neither is dependency management in the world of front end. I would love dependency management to work like a time machine. Before a package is first released, it should capture all the information it needs about its dependencies and then lock them in. Once all tests pass, it should lock the end result into an immutable state where no caret symbol can come and change this somewhere down the line. As a developer, I want to install a dependency at any version when it was released, and I want to see it in the shape that it was in when it was first released and it just worked. Because time moves on, and most maintainers do not care about old versions of their package. It's all about the latest and greatest version that was released yesterday. But we all know that this isn't practical. Yarn was invented to fix all sorts of package management issues, but we still have a long way to go. What happened to me downgrading Gatsby can happen to anyone using any other library. The thing that helped me the most was going through Gatsby's repository and looking up existing issues. If you find yourself in a similar situation, try that. If you can't find anything, raise an issue. Sometimes raising an issue that's already been resolved, you'll help someone else who might be in a similar situation like yours. It's a good way to make maintainers aware of a particular issue, especially if it keeps coming up again and again. In my case, I found a pull request which was responsible for a big refactoring for a scroll position feature. I looked up which release it was attached to. I then tried to downgrade that associated package through dependency resolutions. Try it out. It might just work. To wrap up, I thought I would tie this to the real issues of today. During the pandemic, lots more people got into baking. So instead of leaving you with a carrot from package JSON, I'd rather leave you with a carrot cake recipe. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Did anyone have any questions at all? I've not seen anything come through on the chat, so I'm not sure if there's anything there. Just give it a couple of minutes to see if anyone pops anything in there. No? Okay, no worries. If not, I'll go on. Sorry.
So when you talk about stay calm, do your research, look up existing issues, I think that's absolutely right. Sometimes can be easier said than done when you are working on something totally unrelated to package management, but a package management issue decided to come your way. How do you essentially decide when you've run into an issue like this, how far to keep going in that research, and when to say, okay, it's not worth the amount of time to raise this as an issue, or it's not worth going down this path. Let me try something else. Can you I don't know, tell a bit of a story of that?
Sure, I think it's a really good question. I think it's very difficult to make a good judgment of what is the kind of reasonable line where you kind of say, I'm going to stop looking at a specific assumption and I might try like another avenue. I think it's always good to try to run this past like a colleague and just see if you're missing anything obvious before you determine that this could be coming specifically from a library. And I think depending on the tool and depending on what it's doing, like in this case, Gatsby, it's just, it's like it's underpinning your whole application. So it's very difficult to kind of extract it out of the context and see whether things improve. But you could definitely try that as like a very radical measure. And I suppose depending on the kind of library that you're using, the approach could be really varied, because if you have a small dependency that is responsible for a very small thing, debugging process might be much easier because it might have a very short dependency list. You might be able just to go through, let's say, 3 or 4 different dependencies and just check if there's something in their GitHub, if you can't find anything else that is specific. Like in Gatsby's case, a lot of these errors are suppressed within their own package. So you kind of have to know where to look. And I think seeing errors that I shared in my examples just go to show that they're quite an informative. Maybe the Redux one is more confusing than the Yoga pre-built, the layout pre-built thing, because you can actually take that string that says, here is the library, and just see where in your node modules is being called. But it's got to be like a mixture of ways to do that. But it's like, yeah, it's in a case like Gatsby, it might be easier just to raise an issue and for someone to say, hey, someone else raised that, or like this has been solved, and just close it immediately. Or they might say, oh, we don't know what was going on here, because you might have a specific setup. So sometimes reaching out can be a difficult thing to do, but I find that it can be it can highlight some other issues for package maintainers. Yeah.
I have 2 other follow-up questions I can ask, but I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Go ahead.
All right. So as you are doing that investigation, are there any particular ways of just organizing the information you find in your debugging that you find are helpful to just keep the clarity of what's going on, or what the possible, what your hypotheses are, especially given that you don't hopefully run into package management problems every day?
Yeah, I think like as a developer, naturally you kind of think, I hope this is something small. I can just switch versions and hopefully this just works so I can just move on with my life. I think this is what most people will naturally want the outcome to be. And I think initially you might not have any notes. It's when you kind of feel like you explored whatever paths you kind of had on your mind, that you then decide, you know what, I need to start document what I tried and what kind of gave me different results, or maybe you always ended up hitting the same wall. And this is what I kind of did in my case, where at some point I thought I need to raise an issue, but it has to show that it's something that comes up with different combinations of different packages. Because some people were saying, hey, it's not Gatsby, it's if you install Gatsby with this Gatsby CLI at this specific version, it will work just fine, and it didn't. But yeah, it's in any case, it's a very, very frustrating process. And I think ultimately, when you think what would be most useful when you look through different packages, I think you kind of think that at the time you release a package, you will test your tool at the time it was released. And I kind of think ideally you would want to capture that and just lock it in, rather than think that a year later this might no longer work because another dependency somewhere down the tree changed something and there is no way to address that. It's almost like it makes the whole versioning in some ways redundant, because there's no way to replicate like a specific version.
I think you're onto something there with the importance of replication as the source of the frustration, right? Because this is first something where your attention's been jerked away, but then also, you know, as programmers, we're used to being able to, you know, rerun our code, right? If we're debugging something in a web app, right, we can just, okay, keep running the same unit test or keep, you know, reloading the browser and hitting the same point in the debugger. But because like we don't spend that much time dealing with package management issues, we don't have necessarily the same thing that feels like a loop of progress, right? When you rerun a test and reproduce a bug, modify things with the bug, you know, get more information, you feel a sense of progress. Whereas I think that to keep yourself in that sort of good flow state, even though you're facing something frustrating, I would tend to seek, you know, how can we introduce reproducibility to debugging a package management issue?
Yeah, and I think this is, it kind of boils down to the fact that a lot of people don't want to attach dependency updates. Because when I, for example, was looking at Gatsby's changelog, I didn't see anything that was saying breaking changes or this library or this change depends on that change. As in, like, as I was scrolling through older versions, I didn't see anything like that, which was making the whole debugging process so frustrating, because you think that's a popular library that shouldn't be happening, and all of your assumptions kind of fall apart because you kind of think that we would adhere as community to like some sort of principles that would not put us in a position as complicated as this.
Yeah, and I think there's something to the word shouldn't or should, that, you know, if you're attached to that, right? This is getting a bit psychological, right? But if you have that attachment to, you know, this shouldn't be happening, I shouldn't be having this, you know, problem, I should be able to just move on to, you know, writing my interface, and you sort of hold that attachment rather than accepting, hey, I have entered the world of untangling some yarn for 2 hours. It's a lot easier to think more clearly and to see yourself acting with a sense of mastery if you first accept that you've run into and are now solving a package management issue.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, and I think I would imagine that if this is something that a lot of people find themselves encountering in their own development, I would say that, you know, as long as we keep raising this as a problem, you know, we can then make progress in terms of, you know, better dependency management. Yeah.
I actually wonder, this is a bit, might be a bit crazy, but, you know, the rarity of the problem is part of the psychological toll that it takes, right? It's what prompts the shouldn't. And it's what prompts you to, you know, when you go to try to, you know, be like, okay, now I'm already frustrated, I'm trying to figure out yarn, let me just learn how to solve these in general, right? The thing that motivated me to attend your talk, because of the relative rarity, you're never going to see a Flexbox Froggy, but for debugging yarn issues, right? You're never going to see like somebody sat down and written like a you know, tutorial that you work through on, here's a, you know, sticky situation with yarn, or, you know, on the back end, here's a sticky situation with a Ruby that depends on Sherlock Holmes, and deliberately approach learning how to debug and solve that. And I wonder if the honest solution as a community is to admit hey, we're going to try our best to make dependency management work great, but we're human, we will fail, and dependencies are things you choose, so you're putting stuff together. So we're going to give you the tool to really mentally grapple with this situation when you enter it. Here's a tutorial you can work through and then come out of with a greater sense of mastery.
Yeah,
as boring as that sounds, I don't know.
I suppose one thing that could come out of this is perhaps looking at this through a totally different angle, where dependency management just will be reinvented in some other ways that, you know, I at the moment can't think of, because I probably don't understand every single problem that is associated with dependency management. So yeah, it's something that I run into, and I know other people have encountered this in some shape or form, and I think sharing that is like part of having that discussion in terms of how can we make things better.
Does anyone else have any other questions at all for Joseph? Looks like not. Well, yeah, Joseph, thank you very much for that. Really enjoyed that discussion at the end. This session has been recorded, so we will make sure to upload it to our YouTube page and to share it on LinkedIn and all the social channels. Obviously, will be shared with Simply Business directly as well. So thank you very much again to Joseph for your talk, and to Julia for helping to organise this. It's been another JavaScript in London event, and yeah, we'll be in touch the next time we have something running again. Thank you all for tuning in, and have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.